Welcome to Season 8 of Creativity in Captivity. I'm Warren Etheredge. Today I have a very special guest. He's either a true Renaissance man or professionally indecisive. He has a long list of credits that include writer, producer, director, stand-up, and creative consultant. He is a man who embodies the best of Heartland values and the humor of the Corn Belt. He may be best known to listeners as the host of the podcast Creativity in Captivity. Coming up is my conversation with the head of the Humor Resources Department at Sweetwood Creative, Pat Hazell.
That spark of electricity, a skipping stone that sets you free. You're captive to a mystery, the curse of creativity. La 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 la. La 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 la.
I'm tightening my corn belt right now as we speak.
That happens. With age, that happens. Thank you for being here, Pat. I know the tables have turned a little bit, and maybe we should let people know that this is not a podcast coup. This is actually just another indicator of how creative you are.
I think of it as kind of a Tom Sawyer move, which is to get you to paint the fence while I sit over here.
Well played. You should have told me that afterwards, but well done. I joke about the professionally indecisive, but it's something that I've dealt with a lot in my own life. My mother passed away earlier this year, and she died not knowing what the hell it is I do.
Well, first of all, let me say I have heart. I'm sorry to hear about your mother's loss, but I totally relate. And it's funny that you picked up on that as the first thing. When starting out in high school and going into college, everybody would say, pick a thing, get a lane to get in. Like, no, you can't do that. You can't do that and that and that. And I kind of always thought about having a toolkit where if I could just strengthen this and that, eventually it would appear that I would know what I was doing. I took some dance classes, all things that people are like, enough. You don't need to know how to do fencing. I took it because Three Musketeers was going to be playing at the Omaha Playhouse and I wanted to audition. So I went to fencing class for 8 weeks. I did hear somewhere along the line that if you learn to fence, you can get a scholarship pretty quickly because there aren't that many people that are prepared to fence on their college team and then go on to the Olympics. Fencing life is a good life.
You missed an opportunity. I find this interesting because there's a piece of advice that I've heard a bunch, the idea of dig one well. If you're looking for water, just keep digging down, don't dig 100 holes. And intellectually, I get it, but I can't do it. And I'm trying to figure out if that's a shortcoming of our intellects or just an amazing curiosity that we share.
Well, I love that curiosity notion. I will say that I've also heard the thing about being 2 feet from gold, which means that if you dig a lot of holes, you're more likely to hit it than if you just keep digging down. It feels to me that diversity appeals to me, a variety of things that interest me. And I don't necessarily expect them to all to monetize, but I really think curiosity drives the idea of it doesn't matter what a person's creative about. For example, a choreographer, a visual artist, there is a process and I'm excited about the journey of it. So I want to get to know more or learn more. And I don't profess to be an A+ student of any of these fields, including the ones that I'm known for. I'm a solid B- in a lot of areas. For sure it's passing, but it's sort of just good enough because I don't have a dream to pole vault over the highest bar. But I do think it's interesting as I got older, and I imagine you have a very similar situation, is all of those curiosities now come into play. Certainly as a moderator, which you do, and in interviews, crossing from cinema into television, into writing, it's a very fluid thing if you have a big foundation.
Absolutely. What I'm fascinated by is that I would make the argument, and this may be purely self serving, that by doing multiple things, I make each of my efforts in any of those arenas better. Like I'm learning more, I'm drawing more from each. I'm a better film educator for continuing to produce and write films. I'm a better programmer for continuing to work with young filmmakers. They all sort of circle around each other. That's my justification.
I would concur. I would back you in a bar fight on that subject.
We'd go far with that duo.
Well, I don't think the two of us would get in or out of the bar. But the fact is, I feel like there's a saying I like, which is that a man with two watches never really knows what time it is. And that is that when I do work on a project, I try to focus on that project. But it doesn't mean that I can't have a list of commitments that I say, oh, when I'm finished with this, I'm going to do this. Because I do find that if I don't make those priorities in a certain order, then I have a tendency to have half finished projects going left and right. But having a network of people, this podcast was the most interesting accidental network building because the pandemic was there and I was looking for something to allow people to have a hopeful view of creativity and not wallow in why we couldn't do things, but what is it that we are looking forward to doing or how do we do it, the why behind the creative folks. Well, in the meantime, I made friends with people in all these fields, and now we have this sort of invisible net weaving project where I'll get a call from somebody and say, "Hey, that person you interviewed about that, can you connect me?" And we're kind of just a conduit for it. But if I need a photographer or I need a calligrapher or if I need a dinosaur sculptor, these people are there. I hadn't needed one before, but now I'm looking for reasons.
Always good to have a calligrapher on speed dial. You just never know. I need some wedding invite stat. We go back to the idea of being a student and getting graded. I know for myself, I've conducted, I think, around 4,000 interviews at this point. That part of it is while I was forced to be an A student when I was a kid, I never liked being a student. I love learning from the source. So for me, getting to do interviews is fantastic because it's better than reading a book. You get to interact, get the questions you want answered. And I was wondering how that plays out for you. Does the podcast serve your curiosity? You feel like you're better than a B minus student as a host?
I would prefer to be graded by you because I have no idea. I have moderated conversations at festivals, but I never really considered myself, certainly in radio or podcasting, a host. So when I got into this, I listened to the first couple of episodes, and while I had very interesting guests and high level folks to talk to, I was anxious because I was thinking, oh, a host is supposed to do this. Or I was kind of not pretending to be a host, but in my head, somebody had said, oh, by this moment, you should be reintroducing the topic. And I was thinking about things. And now I don't think about things at all. And because of that, I feel like everything is improved. And I don't feel as if I have to tell stories or not tell stories. I'll reveal some secrets, which is that sometimes I tell a story to get a story because it's sort of like this time this happened to me and people go, oh, that kind of happened to me. And then we might cut my story before we get to air on it because their story is similar and so much better. So we just lead with the question and nobody knows that I barfed in junior high and it had to be cleaned up or sawdust had to be put on it. But that seems to happen at the Thanksgiving table, I find, is that people are natural storytellers if they are in conversation. If you force them, if you say, hey, tell everybody an interesting story, they panic. But if you begin to tell something, they've always go, oh, yeah, something like that happened to me.
I certainly agree that I think part of the human nature in conversation is that the more you model the behavior of storytelling and vulnerability, the more you get out of your guest, certainly.
I admire you as an interviewer and a host and a moderator. I first saw you at the Austin Film Festival and I thought, okay, this guy does his research. He's listening. There were lots of things that I thought, this is interesting. I wonder how he does that. But I realize now after the years of doing it that it is a matter of just grabbing the various skill sets and listening and being present, which is much more important than what any list of questions would be.
I mean, I certainly agree with that. I know it throws people because I'll often teach workshops both in interviewing skills and or conversational skills. And for the interviews, I have never written a question for an interview that I've done because I always have the sense that if I have a list of questions, I'll be thinking about the next question rather than listening to the answer. And I've seen that play out terribly. It can feel like a little bit of a high wire act, but it makes you more present. If you don't know what's next, you're going to be more actively engaged, I think.
Well, typically, when I started doing this, I would write one question that I considered to be my Hail Mary pass question, or there's a 7-minute lull and we're looking at each other. So I did it not out of insecurity, but I thought, okay, if I need this question, it'll be there. But I mean, we're talking about 45-minute interviews, so it wasn't like that much of a life raft, but it was usually something clever. And the reason I needed that, for example, with Frank Oz, he was a good interview, but I know Frank, and he has a tendency to be challenging because he likes debate and argument. He would rather be contradictory than conciliatory. So I feared that he would do that right away. And I thought, I'm going to have to use my question coming out of the box. I'm going to have to throw him off balance so he knows who's in charge. And I know that sounds weird, but that was one particular guest behavior. So I had written on a card, what's on your coma reading list? And he was like, wait, what does that mean? And I go, you're in a coma. And what book is it that we read to you in case you're still in there? He went into thought, some deep thought. And so instead of sort of twisting it, he goes, well, do I live? Do I not live? I go, let's assume you live when you come out of it. But he went to the collected works of Emily Dickinson, which turned out to be a true and deep answer that impressed me. And in that case, I was like, oh, I'm glad that I had prepared something. I didn't expect or know where it would go, but it's a little bit like a road flare. So you just send it up, hope somebody comes.
I think it's a smart move. I love the question. I've never heard a question like that. I know that I would pick a short book, hoping that I'd get out of the coma sooner. Maybe like a C Spot Run, something like that. Maybe I'm out sooner.
You understand that you don't read it in the coma. We read it to you, the book.
Yeah.
The comas aren't based on the length of the book, just so you know.
I know there's no logical sense for that, but that's where my brain goes. Like if I picked Tolstoy, I'd be screwed. One of my relatives would go like, oh, I forgot where we were. Let's start again. I'm like, oh my God. In the spirit of Pat Hazell, I was going to share a story about questions and having something planned or not. Years ago, I was hosting a series of live events called Words and Wine. It was like talks with authors. And we were doing the inaugural one, and we were offered the chance to have James Fry as a guest, the guy who wrote Million Little Pieces. So people loved the book. It was inspiring for recovering addicts. It was the thing. And it was an Oprah Book Club sensation. And it was billed as autobiography. And then the part came out that it wasn't all true. If you enjoy Schadenfreude or just watching people suffer, if you Google James Fry and Oprah for when she invites him back on to confront him, you see the power of Oprah harnessed for evil. They promised we could have James Fry as a guest, and I was like, absolutely. It would be the first public interview with him since this thing. He'd gone quiet for a couple of years, but they made promise through all the publicists that we would not ask about that controversy. And I so desperately want to do it. I just, said, sure, we won't ask about that. Who would want to know about that? Let's talk about his new novel. Sure. I had lied about it so often that I started to believe that I wasn't going to ask about it. And the night came and I realized I have to ask him about it. How can I not ask him about it? Like the audience would be upset. I'd be upset with myself. And he'd written this new novel, and there are the chapters, but in between there are these lists of little trivia facts about LA. And so in my little fevered brain, I decided to open the conversation with, so James, what does it feel like to write a book with actual facts in it? And there was a long silence, and I thought, okay, this could be the end of this series. And there was a long silence, and then he said, the funny thing is, not even all those facts are true.
Oh, that's a very clever answer.
And we both laughed. And the beautiful thing was that it opened it up, and we moved away from that. We talked about the new novel, but he would choose to come back to it himself, and he would talk about the controversy. And so by the end of the evening, he had sort of unspooled the whole story, but in a space that he felt was safe. So I understand that idea of a question.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting because there was some trust and respect. You tested the boundary, but you let him guide you through. It's a little like barbed wire fencing around the property. You're not supposed to go in there, but you can see everything. It shows you the perimeter, and you're like, would you mind if we took a look at the real estate while we're standing here? I remember a funny question. Alec Berg, who was a writer and director and worked on Seinfeld and lots of other things. He had directed the Cat in the Hat feature film. And when I was interviewing him in front of the Austin Film Festival crowd, I knew he had a sense of humor, but I got kind of in a couple of questions and I said, Alec, Cat in the Hat, why? And he just started laughing. He goes, look, you don't set out to make the worst movie that was ever made. Like, that's not your goal when you make a movie. But the source material was a book with 39 words repeated over and over. Consider what we were building it out of. But you do take a little bit of risk when you do that in front of an audience, and it looks like you're going to give the guy the raspberry.
I mean, you knew Alec, you had history with him, and also you are just a genuinely affable person.
Affable's already a good thing, but you had to put genuinely. So in your case, you're saying that you're not sincere with your affability?
I think I'm sincere. I'm not sure other people think I am.
Okay, well, I will say you're convivial for sure, but you're also very smart, and I think you know it and you let other people know it. One of the things that I liked about inviting you to do this is that I also find you to have kind of a dry wit. It's kind of like somebody who can sneak into a room and set off some firecrackers and run out. There's a smile. You give away that you know what you're doing when you're smirking.
That blows my cover, but yes, I like that. That's my MO. Uh, I want to talk about Alec Berg indirectly. You mentioned Seinfeld, and you were a story consultant on Seinfeld Chronicles, the first fabulous year. I'm curious because I really do find this fascinating because I'm trying to work through it. I know Brian Regan has been a guest on your podcast, and I love Brian Regan. I think the two of you share something like there's a decency to your comedy. It seems very middle America in the best possible way. And then you're working with Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David, who are more my people, New York Jews. and, and Larry David may have just a little bit of an edge to him. But you're writing comedy, you're working with them. And I was trying to figure out you're in, because when you're writing comedy, you're sort of writing for somebody else, not your own sense of humor. And I'm guessing that your in was more through Jerry and the sort of shared Americana nostalgia. Is that fair to say?
No, it's absolutely true. Jerry and I had bonded along the way in clubs and stand up. He had had me as an opening act for his very first special. He shot at the Roxy in Hollywood. At that time, I had a variety act. I did some stand up, but I was doing some magic. I was doing some juggling. And I thought he was being avuncular when he said to me, you know what? Just leave that stuff behind. Like, you can do stand up. You're not going to lose your job. I thought he was encouraging me. What he was doing was trying to get me to get rid of the stuff so we didn't have to stop at baggage claim and wait for the props. But nonetheless, I always liked Americana. I always were nostalgic, but I was doing impressions of Little Green Army Men where I would stand in their poses and tell you what they were thinking. I was very physical and animated. And what was very interesting is at that time, Jerry was very much a button down comic. He had the sleeves rolled up and the thin tie, and he was very in control. And somewhere along the line, just being around each other, I began to get more serious about my writing, and his storytelling got a little bit more animated. We were learning that. And he did like my sense of humor. Because I was watching his act as an opener, I began to sort of throw him tags on things, and they would work. And so when I would occasionally see something on the Tonight Show and I would go, oh, I got a joke on there. It wasn't like I was doing it, but it had made its way to television. When I was doing the variety, I was no competition to anyone because I was the middle act at the Comedy Magic Club. But I feel like he understood me. He did come see a few things that I had written. My spec script to get the Seinfeld job was a play called Bunk Bed Brothers. I had co-written it with a guy named Matt Goldman, and Matt and I got the first two jobs with Larry and Jerry. And that was kind of at the time called the Seinfeld Chronicles, and we were just sort of making our way. And there were so many lessons that came. They didn't know what they were doing either. They were sure that they wanted to entertain themselves. Jerry always said, look, we're not going to be like those other things on TV. If we don't like those shows, or if we wouldn't sit and watch them, why would we do something like that? So I think at the time, maybe Murphy Brown and Family Ties and some things were kind of the leader of the pack. And instead of it being family centered, it was what if the Friends were the family, which really broke ground for Friends and Ellen and all the other people that became Friends sitcoms. And it was really unbelievable. Now, I will say the most different two personalities were me and Larry David. I was Catholic, I was Midwestern, and I would pitch some things at times, and he'd go, "That could never happen." I go, "Well, it did happen. I mean, this is based on a true story." "No, it didn't." I go, "I'm not gonna argue with you. You don't have to use it, but it happened." "No, I don't think it could have happened." "Well, it did, Larry." Like, you get into that Curb Your Enthusiasm stare with him sometimes. And he's a uniquely talented guy, and I feel like he broke a lot of ground because of his stick to itiveness. Like he would say to the network, nope, not going to make it shorter. I'll make it longer if you want this to be a 1 hour episode, but I'm not cutting anything, you know? And I would go, geez, it just felt like if we were entertaining ourselves as the audience, well, either the other audience would come along and enjoy what we enjoyed, or we'd sink the ship. But at that point, Jerry used to say to me, if, be the captain of your own ship. And if it goes down, you can do it proudly. If you board the other ship, if you go on to what the network tells you to do and it goes down, then you have no explanation of why the boat went down.
I mean, I totally agree with that advice. I'm a big believer that you may as well just do the thing you believe in because that's the best barometer, if nothing else. I can't force myself to be somebody else. I mean, I could, but I don't want to. But that is a nice segue because I want to go back to the stand-up thing I'm fascinated by. You and I share that background. Stand-up to me is amazing because if you do stand-up, you can do anything as far as I'm concerned. Because when you're on stage, you realize, unlike an actor in a play or in film or a playwright or even a musician in a band, the audience is there for you. And if they hate you, they really hate you specifically.
Right.
And if you can wake up the next morning, you're okay. And then realize it's pretty simple. But I'm curious because you did it from both ends. You did stand up and then you wrote for other comedians. Was it hard to watch somebody else spouting your material, or did it give you a sense of safety?
I don't think I would say either. First of all, I didn't find it more difficult. I was always proud if something landed. If somebody stole a joke I wrote and did it, I was furious. But if I had written it for them or given it to them or there was an understanding, I was just as intrigued as they were because to me, it's trying to make a boat that floats. And the only way in a play or anything else that you can be sure that it works for the most people is by watching it and then tweaking it and making it a little better. And once you get each of those things together, like if you're making a monologue or you're making a something bigger, you don't want places where it falls apart. So I love the nuance, and I love talking to stand-ups that have fought the war. So you have shorthand with people, and you have no shame in saying to somebody, "Hey, you might think about reversing the order. You might think about changing your setup, and your punchline will land a little better." And they backstage where they might go, "Oh, I'm going to try that right now. Like I'm not going to wait till tomorrow. Next chance on stage." You're a doctor of comedy, and I don't have any like right to say I have a PhD in comedy, but the longer you're in it and the more times you get out of a mess, you begin to say, "Oh, okay, this joke should be said on the move. I shouldn't be standing and looking at the audience," which helps you as a writer. It helps you as a director. And I think maybe that's a little more what other people's doing my material. It feels as if I'm a director guiding them towards the finish line.
Do you think some of those things you're talking about just now are things you just sort of understand innately, intuitively, and can only be learned over time? Or do you think they're hard and fast rules?
I don't think they're hard and fast. But that's what's interesting about directing a play is actors are really talented. They know the character. They know what's going on. Not all of them understand that if you do this scene back to back, it's going to create more tension. If you do this looking out at the audience and they're sitting at the desk, it's going to send a different emotional message. So I do think that things like that are learnable. And it doesn't mean that you always use the same series of things. You start to understand that ultimately it's all storytelling. Even in stand up, it's storytelling. The negative space, the pauses mean something. And I don't profess to know how every one of them works or why. I just know that I know when it doesn't work, not just from being a stink bomb, but when you go, "Ooh, something's not right here. The rhythm's not right." It's almost musical to your ear. And I also know that when it is right, like if I'm directing a cast and we get into rehearsal and now everything is firing on all pistons, I could fall asleep in the audience watching them rehearse because it's not wrong. And the second somebody slips up, I'll pop up and go, "Hang on a second." It's so strange. It is almost something where you just need to set the symphony in the right tone and tempo, and then you can enjoy it.
There's so many things you do. Do you find that you derive more pleasure, really much greater pleasure from any one of them?
Huh. That's an excellent question. I mean, it's interesting when I'm in the groove, when I'm doing stand up or hosting an event where I do custom material and I find that these are brand new jokes and they're slaughtering right now, untested practically. I feel a certain exhilaration. But it's just as important to me that I make a good business deal. Like the next day, I don't go, oh, I'm the greatest stand up. It's only momentary. I enjoy it. The adrenaline coming off that show and you go to bed, and to me, it goes away. And then I work on the next thing. And I think that the more I'm working in a creative vein, it doesn't matter so much to me whether I'm producing or directing or writing, because I feel like, hey, what's the right brush for the painting right now? What's the best for today? This is a really fun and exciting exchange with you, because it's no different than the regular podcast, except I don't really know where the stagecoach is going. It's not a runaway stagecoach. It's safe, but like I didn't do preparation. I'd love the audience to know more about you, which I will share, but I'm just taking a ride on your coattails right now.
I've heard you talk with your guests about imposter syndrome. And so I love your answer to the previous question, and I believe you. And at the same time, I wonder, is there any element of doing all these different things that is covering for what if I'm a fraud in one of those departments?
Well, I'm a fraud in many of them, but I will say that the one that terrifies me the most, I'm writing a book right now that I've been writing way too long. And it's not a narrative, so it's not like, oh, I just have to finish the story. The challenge is that I'm trying to write a book about how to write a book. And so I'm trying to deconstruct all of those artistic vulnerabilities and those things. And on some days, I'm tremendously excited that I go, okay, I'm procrastinating. I'm going to write about that. I'm going to say, what do I normally do on a day when I think I'm getting a lot done and I'm not? I'm a multitasker. Oh, I can get all these tasks done and whatever. Well, you know what I'm doing? I'm not writing. I'm doing all those things so that I don't have to write. I'm admitting certain things. So the purpose and focus of the book is that if you're a creative person of any kind and you have projects you want to do, if you read the book at the same time as you're working on a project, then by the time we finish the book, you will have had all the same thoughts at some point, and you will then put away your excuses. And it isn't a book where it says, do this today and then you'll get this far. It's just that the patterns of creative people I find are very similar. And some days it's really tough. Other days it's really awesome. Some days you do it for the glory. They say it's always better to have written than to be writing. And so to get to that day, you actually have to put the words down. And it means that you have to put your ego aside. It's not like you can be self-congratulatory the whole time, because it doesn't go anywhere. You have to have a mentality of a bricklayer, that you've got a certain amount of brick, certain amount of mortar. You got to build this foundation. You don't want to build it too big. Otherwise, you got to build a house as big as that and a roof as big as that. So all of it is, I think, kind of scaling it back to discipline, sitting down, even if it's torture, even if it doesn't go well today. It's just about putting some time in and keeping your butt in the seat. And there are many times that I fail at that. And even in the book, I remember when I started, I was on fire during the pandemic because I couldn't have any excuses, because I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have any performances. I didn't have anything to direct. And I was like, oh, I used to be so good at I'll pick up the kids on the car line. Well, those were all obstacles that I found that I was being charitable, or no, I wasn't. I was trying to avoid writing, and I didn't know it. It's a little bit of subconscious thing. So deadlines to me became the way to get places, even if they were false deadlines. If I said I'm going to learn to juggle 5 by Christmas, I might say it to myself, but I would say it to somebody else out loud, which would mean that by Christmas they go, how's your 5 ball? Let's see your dumb thing that you said you were going to do. I would force a deadline so that having your taxes in by April 15th, like the people who do it in the last second only do it because there's a deadline, or they wouldn't at all. I feel like I'm really insecure about this book because it's sort of first person, and it's not a story, and it's not about other things. It's really about how it feels to not know what you're doing.
I'll say two things about procrastination. A friend of mine who I collaborate with who has some struggles with deadlines. I'll say that she has some struggles with deadlines, and has this method of set deadlines for her, or her friends will, and if she doesn't hit her deadline, she makes a $200 contribution to a politician she hates in her own name, and has to do it publicly.
I don't mind that. That's a good humiliation.
And it seems to work really well for her. The other thing I'd say is I was reading a book about procrastination, probably while I was procrastinating on the project, but it's a great thing. And it pointed out that procrastinators get more done. Maybe not the thing you want to get done, but you get so many things done in service of not doing the thing you really need to do. So I
Right.
think that's my career right there.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's about pain and pleasure. So something else more painful, like if I'd rather do my taxes than write, it's evident that the writing is the more difficult thing. So then the pandemic comes along, and it's felt better to write than to be wallowing in self-pity. So I was really writing quite a bit. And I guess the point of what I was going to say when I mentioned that was I reread a section where it said, and come hell or high water, by April, whatever, I'm going to have, well, it was a year later. And I was like, maybe this April. Like I parenthetically decided to insert each time that I had kind of tried to cheerlead myself through a deadline, because we can do that too. We can read more books on a subject where people go, hey, I'm reading more books on screenplay writing. Okay. If you read more than 3, you should be writing a screenplay. There's no more reading that needs to be done. Because I know you go to your website and you see the what, where, who, why, when. That comes to being a good interviewer. I find that the why and the how questions seem to get you the furthest into people's mind, because what feels like scrapbook, like you can find it on their webpage. But is there an approach you take in terms of framing when you're interviewing folks?
Well, I have plenty of beliefs about interviewing, but one of them is, you know, how they say for lawyers, a lawyer should never ask a question that they don't know the answer to. For me, interviewing is the exact opposite. It's like I never want to ask a question that I do know the answer to. I do a lot of research, one, because it makes me comfortable enough to be present with the person. But the other thing is, I don't want to ask something that's out there. Like, I don't want to say, where are you from, Pat? Like, I know where you're from. It may come up somewhere else, but I don't need to cover that. You can find that. I want to get to the questions that we don't hear, the answers that we don't normally get. And frankly, I'm just driven by what tickles my brain. Sort of what you're saying about writing comedies. Like, all I have to go to is like, I don't know if other people will be interested, but I'm guessing and hoping that if I'm really curious about this, somebody else might be.
I think that's similar to cooking. If you're hosting a party and you wanna try a recipe, I feel like people like being guided by people. They like a tour guide into conversation.
It's funny. Sometimes people ask me, "Is there anybody you wouldn't interview?" And it's like, no. Like, and they say, like, "Would you interview Hitler?" And it's like, hell yeah! I mean, what a get! And and more importantly, I do have some questions. I do.
I think there's a lot of why questions.
I really want to talk about the early art years, but otherwise, anybody I've met wants to talk about themselves. So if you create the right space for them to do so, they'll happily do. They'll happily do it.
Well, I can tell you that I've recently experienced that. I had a fractured left foot, and it was broken a couple places, and some surgery was done. So then I had one of those boots on. And you would think that people would have more sympathy and more curiosity. They do not. They see it and they tell you about their injury. They want to show you the picture of the pins in their knee. They talk about their wife's neck injury. Like the amount of self-absorbed injury talk you get if you have an outward facing injury is hilarious to me.
I think it's very human. It's sort of tragic, and I believe it's gotten worse. I don't think it's generational. I think it's sort of societal, this need to constantly bring it back to oneself. I don't know if it's the introduction of the concept of personal branding, but I often feel like people are on some sort of mission to leave with me understanding there's a trademark after their name.
Right. The selfie has become not just a picture. It's become their corporate identity.
Yeah, I find it interesting, and I'm curious how you feel about this because you're an interesting case in where like you have some level of celebrity, or you're known on some level. People know you in the right circles. There's a certain element of what you do that has to be forward or public facing. But at the same time, you've always struck me as an incredibly humble person, despite your successes and all your capabilities. And I wonder how you manage that balance of like, I need to be out there. I sort of need to sell my show. I need to go do my appearances. I need to like promote the authors and speakers I work with. How do you balance that out?
I like the question because I'm not humble bragging in any way to talk about the projects, but I do find that any modest amount of fame or marketing or PR is what you do for ticket sales. That's why you have a Facebook page. That's why you have Instagram and so forth, is that you are trying to communicate at a cost effective way that there's an event going on. But so many times you shouldn't be doing that when you need to finish writing it or rehearsing it or directing it. I really like amplifying other people's stories. So with the guest on this show, with the artists, writers, storytellers that I represent, sort of behind the scenes, most people aren't aware of that. It is very interesting that I'll be in a conversation with Pixar. They have no idea who I am or that I'm a comedian or I'm just that person's representative. They'll talk to me about publishing and we'll make a book deal or something. And they don't know they're talking to a guy who can't write a book because the person that I'm representing, it's very, very easy to amplify other people's stories and tell their stories. But when it's like when you have to negotiate for yourself, and somewhere along the line, maybe a childhood fantasy I had in a playhouse with my friends, but I kept always thinking, wouldn't it be nice to make a thing where everybody could thrive, that everybody would have a shot to do what they do well? And I think I put that hat on probably more often. And yet at the same time, I push myself to run my best time against the clock. I'm not really running against other people in the industry. I feel like, oh, can I top my last project? Can I come up with a new subject that I might be interested in losing sleep over? And in terms of humility, I feel like it's more about maintaining some authenticity. My character on stage isn't quite very different from who I am in person. And it struck me that a few times that I've been in conversation with somebody off stage in the wings of a theater, and 30 seconds later, I'm on stage and they're like, "How do you do that?" I go, "Well, I didn't change into something else." Some people can eat a meal before they go on stage, some can't. And I just think if I trust my voice, if I don't create some falsehood to my sense of humor, then I can sort of get through it. I will say there's been a lot of maturity in my how I present, what I write in terms of being mindful of others. In high school, I was a show off and a grandstander, just trying to be funny and silly and have people pick cards in the lunch line. That need isn't driving it now. It's not about the attention. It's about what can I do to raise the water level for all boats.
So I want to go a little deeper with that because I do find this fascinating. As you've worn many hats, I feel like there's a mirroring in our lives on some of these things. You did create a sitcom to mimic the success of something like a Caroline in Charge, maybe during the Seinfeld years, called American Pie, and you are at the center of that story. And granted, in keeping with what you just said, that character is also humbled on a regular basis.
I chose a character though that wasn't exactly me. I picked the fun brother. I was a funny guy, but I picked the ne'er do well idea. When we first wrote the play that led to that sitcom, Matt Goldman and I wrote it, and he was the button down brother, and I was the brother that was a show off that needed to come home. He didn't admit it, but he had to live with his parents. And I feel like that intrigued me more because I was a do-gooder when I was younger. So I was trying to pick the sort of rogue roustabout brother to play. It was something I was very, very proud of because I decided that again, if I wrote in a way that it was my sense of humor, then I didn't have to act. And in my recent conversation with Paul Reiser, he says that when you're playing yourself, it's kind of cheating. Your character as a stand up, your voice as a writer, it's easy to memorize the lines because you wrote the lines. And in a way, when I read with those actors in front of the network, I didn't feel like I was testing for a sitcom. I was just trying to get laughs. I've often said that I feel like I'm taking a job from an actor because I just put on my own clothes and walk out and do the thing. And if people say he's not a detective, I go, no, I'm not really a detective. I put the suit on and I'm not going into some deep study. And I see actors that I greatly admire that I go, I couldn't go there 8 shows a week and talk about that tragedy.
You were at the center of that sitcom, and I imagine that there's an idea like this could take off or something. And This is where I see, not having known you then, but this change I think I sense in you is that it's one person to be the lead in a sitcom, and it's another to be the multiple cap wearing monkey thief that
That's the part I liked more, and I will say that with NBC, when the time to negotiate that deal came up, my agent said that Pat wants to produce this show. And they said, "Well, we don't give actors producing credit." They do now, but at that time, they really didn't give actors producing credit. So he said, "What do you want to do about that?" I said, "Well, tell them that I would rather produce it than be in it." And he goes, "Well, what if they say no?" I go, "We'll cast an actor," because I feel like I can run this show and I can get these stories told. And I really wasn't afraid of it, but I didn't care one way or the other. And what was interesting was after reading all the actors and them having me read, they said, "Oh, it seems like you're the best person for that." Like they by default said, "Oh, well, we didn't find a better actor for that Pat part." It wasn't like a calculated risk. It was that I really would have preferred to take this thing much further as a producer if it came down to the visible forward facing fame versus a chance to really launch it. And it was a quite an obscure project. We only made 6 episodes and it was really fun, but we were kind of set adrift with our crew out a little away from Burbank and not kind of in the main studios area. That gave us a lot of room to breathe from a writing, performing, shooting standpoint. I guess we got to do it our way, and that felt really good.
you've covered so much ground. I know for myself that because I'm curious, I like to challenge myself because it keeps me fresh on some level and it keeps me engaged. Are there things that you see yourself doing in the near or far future that are different than what you're doing right now? Do you aspire to something else other than fencing for the scholarship?
I feel like there's always another challenge out there, but I like staying in this kind of circle of humor, heart, and humanity. I like to stay in this sort of area that I feel is the sweet spot for inspiring people, motivating folks, tu turning the heat up because I have become a champion of the creative person. And look, as much as I'm not an expert on it, I just know how good it feels when it happens to me. If somebody comes along and says, "Hey, we want to come see your next play," or "What are you doing next?" I go, "Oh, that's what is moving me along here is that we end up with a little bit of a tribe that we discover only through the art we make. And it doesn't attract everyone, but as that audience grows, and I don't do it for the demand that they say we have to have it now. I just feel really stimulated by making things, like bringing things to life. And the form doesn't matter that much anymore to me. I've been enjoying consulting on other people's projects, finding stories with people, directing commercials. All of that stuff is a little less about being a performer and staying away from the brand of me. But it's kind of a transferable skill because then it's the coffee maker that's the star, and we just need to figure out how to tell its story. I wrote a musical that I would love to see come to life, and we had an opportunity to have a staged reading in New York, and it's sort of in a place where if we raise the right money, I would like to not see that on mothballs forever. It's called Grounded for Life, and I wrote it with a guy named Larry Goldberg, who was a tremendous musician and conductor, and we had so much fun doing it. Also, there was a guy named Bill Habib that was involved in the book. We did a stage reading in New York on invitation with a live audience. It was so thrilling to hear the laughs and the songs. And I fought the notion of the musical for a very long time. But it was really, really cool to learn, very challenging. Since I watch more musicals and I go, oh, what's the I Want song and what's the 11 o'clock number? So I would love to raise the funds and get that out there because to me, when you don't get stuff into the audience's hands, it's a loss. I don't care if it's a big hit, but I feel like the only barometer of whether it was worth doing is to see it with the audience in some form. That's why I think I make so many things is that it's kind of like delivering a gift to a group.
Well, you've given many gifts to the world out there, and there's always an audience. It's always just a matter of can you find that audience. But if you keep at it, you get them. I have found in my life my approach to art and creativity has evolved. And if I'm to be completely honest with myself, I think initially there was some of that hope of legacy or immortality or just plain old celebrity. Who knows? But, something sort of self serving for the ego. And I think as I've gotten older, I've come closer to embracing art as a mandala. Like you put it out there, people appreciate it, you have that moment, it's ephemeral, and you move on, and that's okay. Is that sort of what you're saying by not having your name on there? Like just having the thing, let it be what it is, it's okay, and you can move on?
I would say I share a kind of a balance. That is what I call the etch a sketch mentality, which I always loved. When you shake that thing, it's not coming back. I do like that for some things. Other things, I would have liked the American Pie sitcom to have made the airways. It didn't really get out there. We made the 6 episodes. One episode played in half the country. World Series game ran short on the East Coast, and they knew there was going to be time in Mountain Time and Pacific Time where there was going to be this dead half hour. And it was, I want to say that was Labor Day, or there was nobody at the station. It was a holiday, and some dude at NBC goes, "Well, this is finished. I'll just put this in," right? As if it's all run off of one VCR. He put the show on, and it came on in maybe Central Time and Mountain Time, but my mom saw it and says, "Hey, your sitcom's on," and I didn't know that. And I go, "What?" And she goes, "No, it's on right now after the World Series." I go, "What?" And then subsequently, we were able to see it on Pacific Time, that one episode. So I thought, "Oh, this is the start of something gigantic." What I came to find out when they went to do it is it kind of ruined the package. Like they were like, "Well, we didn't really get the numbers because we can't count the East Coast and we don't know if it did well. And the World Series is such a big lead in and whatever." It's like, "Well, why don't you start putting it on and find out?" "Well, because now we kind of damaged this." And it's not anything you have anything to do with. But I think why I was so proud of that is that we built a go-kart with parts, and we got all our favorite people together and we cast it a certain way, and we worked with a bunch of directors. They told me with 6 episodes that we wouldn't get any good background talent in terms of costumers and set decorators. They go, "Nobody's going to take a short order like this." Well, we kind of crowded ourselves into a schedule. I want to say that it was a Tuesday, Wednesday, where they would do camera blocking and they'd shoot the show on Wednesday, or Thursday, Friday. So these camera crews and these directors, their bulk of their week was all taken. And I said, "Well, who shoots on Saturday and Sunday?" And they go, "Nobody. You can't do that." I go, "Why can't we do that?" And they go, "Well, nobody's going to work overtime." I go, "It's not overtime. They're working for a new company, like different people." And they said, "Well, good luck trying to pitch that." Because it was a short order, we were able to get unbelievable costumer from Friends and a hairdresser from this and a props person from Seinfeld and a number of directors, Jamie Widows and Andrew Sau, and some great people. And so I've really felt like the making of it. I was really proud of the way we pulled the team together, and we made really great and fun art in what you would call that sort of superficial, glossy sitcom kind of art. But it was really something we were proud of, and unfortunately, it sits in the vaults somewhere. It went from being must-see TV to musty TV. I will say William Ragsdale, who played my brother, it was like working with Jack Lemmon. This guy can deliver a line in kind of a stuttery way that seems so real and authentic. He was really a charming guy to work with. And what we learned, and this is a writer's thing, which is pay attention to everybody's monkey trick, whatever they're good at. Are they a person that delivers a punchline? Dave Allen was very musical. We had to write his material so that we could block him so he could almost musically get to the joke. So you never tell the person what it is, but you know exactly what part where you want them on the SWAT team. And this person goes in the high tower and this person stays on the ground. So it's really important, I think, in the development of content to cast well, but also to kind of know what people's abilities are and then challenge them to do other things besides what they always pull out of their hat.
Agreed, and I'm also would not be ashamed to rely on them doing the thing they do, do well. And to me, I just find it fascinating because anybody who does comedy has those things, and part of it can be in the language or how they handle rhythms. But I've always been intrigued by somebody like Jon Stewart when he was doing The Daily Show. Very funny while seated behind a desk, never funny when he got up from behind the desk.
Interesting.
I don't know why.
It's important to me, regardless of where we go from here, that I tell the audience to go to warrenetheredge.com, because I want them to know more about you. We've been centered around my creation and my ideas, but I feel like you have such a big pond for them to kind of go through and see what you're up to. And we haven't really even talked about movies or cinema, which you know a great deal about. But I picked you because I felt like I loved your style of approach to things, and I wanted to be sure that other people kind of were able to discover you.
I thank you for making that past tense. So clearly it did not go well today. But I also know the show is called Creativity and Captivity, and I assume that you've been under house arrest for 7 seasons now or something like that. Is that what's happening?
The title preceded the pandemic, and however, it came out during the pandemic, so it feels like I've been sequestered. The intent was that we were taking a guest, holding them captive for an hour, and then releasing them back into the wild. So that the notion of how it was named, Creativity and Captivity, it was just happenstance, but it was really just the idea that how could we study creative people under a microscope? That's what it was intended to be.
I think it's important now, after all this time, to give you your report card and tell you how you've done.
I'm standing by.
You get an A+++++ in Christmas Story style for effort, and I mean this in the most important ways. I am so motivated, inspired, and just sort of awed by how much you get done in so many arenas. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Creativity is a big thing, but creativity doesn't really happen without follow through. And the fact that you've been able to produce so much yourself in terms of writing and shows, but then also your willingness, your graciousness, and generosity to do that on behalf of others is, in my people's language, you're a mensch. It's a beautiful thing to do because you've brought so much more art and story and wisdom into the world, for which we're all really thankful. And then as a podcast host, which I say, because I've listened to a bunch of them, I got to give you an A. I got to give you an A. I'm reluctant to give anybody an A+ in anything creative because I don't know what it means. Your balance of you do things differently than I would, which is best for all. I think what you're doing in terms of using storytelling as a conversational tool is unusual. And I think you're perfecting something. You're not only modeling a vulnerability and an honesty that brings out the best in your guests, but I think it also serves you very well. I think one of the hardest things as a host is to honor your guest and make some room for yourself. And I think you've struck just a glorious balance there. So, Pat, thank you for being my guest on season 8. Episode 1 of Creativity and Captivity.
Warren Etheredge, it is fabulous to have this conversation with you as well. And I appreciate your generosity and the invitation.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. Once again, fabulous conversation. I'm going to go procrastinate now. Thank you for having me here.
Thanks for listening. Take a moment to subscribe, and we will hold your seat for more creative conversation and a weekly spark of inspiration. Our show is produced by Sweetwood Creative in Austin, Texas, with sound editing and crafty co-producing by Tucker Hazell. The original music theme was created and sung by Maya Sharp, with additional production support and sanity provided by Diane Johansson, Tony Deo, and Tanner Dykstra. Please feel free to dash off a review on social media to help grow this creative community. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, or visit our website at creativityincaptivity.fun. You heard that right, .fun. As in, that was so fun. Bye for now.
Stare